Welcome back. We now are ready for our last lecture. And this is going to be a roller coaster. Christopher is a man with real, I can say that word, can I? The B word? Yes. And he's very honest with his research, and also about who is responsible and who is doing what. And I think also in the research you have, you always have evidence for what you are stating, a very high degree, which you must have learned as a journalist. I think a lot of journalists in mainstream news you should make a course. First time I met Christopher was Open Mind Conference
Amsterdam.
2 years ago.
Amsterdam.
Yeah, in Amsterdam. The one which had to be moved. Yeah. And there Christopher made a really marvelous speech. So please give Christopher Bollyn a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Frank. Good evening. Can you hear me all right? Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Frank, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be at my second Open Mind Conference. Last time was in Amsterdam, and this time in Copenhagen. It's great to be here. I just finished a 3-month tour in the United States with this subject, ending the dual deception of 9/11 and the global war on terror. And anybody who's been to America in the last few months can tell you that it's a very strange place these days. We're in the middle of a 3-year election campaign, and the American political reality reeks of artificiality. It's so fake, it's so artificial. I looked at Fox News when I was in Wisconsin about 2 weeks ago, and all they talked about for 24 hours a day was whether Trump called Hillary a bigot or Hillary called Trump a bigot. There was an earthquake in Italy that went unreported. And this artificial circus that we have for a political campaign is, of course, so artificial because the media is so controlled. Today in the United States, something like 90% of the media outlets, newspapers, television, radio stations, are owned by only 6 corporations. So you really have a consolidation of the media that is unheard of in a democratic society. So that in this artificial reality that we call the political contest in America and political reality in America, it comes as no surprise that certain issues don't get reported at all. On September 4th of this year, the New York Times reported that the war in Syria was a non-issue in the election. A non-issue. The United States is spending $1 billion a year to overthrow the government in Syria, but none of the candidates are talking about it, and the media is not talking about it, and it's out of sight, out of mind. Likewise with the war on terror. Of course, Syria is just a small part of the war on terror. The United States has been engaged in this 15-year-old war now, spending a total of $4 million per hour just in Afghanistan. So they spend $100 million a day fighting a war in Afghanistan where there's no U.S. national interest whatsoever. So what I'm talking about tonight is the ending the dual deception of 9/11 and the war on terror. Because what I'm trying to impart to people and teach, I've been trying to share this information with my American co-fellows, is that the United States is in a very big predicament. We're going to get a new president now, the 3rd president since 9/11, and nobody's talking about ending the war. Nobody. And understanding that 9/11 was a hoax, and 9/11 was actually done in order to start the war on terror, and that the war on terror has an older history to it that needs to be imparted to people. So it's called Ending the Dual Deception of 9/11 and the Global War on Terror. And this is the predicament in a nutshell. I'll talk for about an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes, and then we can have Q&A, and then I'll wrap it up. The dual deception of 9/11 and the war on terror. 9/11 was carried out to kickstart the war on terror, a global war of aggression, terrorism, and conquest. 9/11 was designed to trick us into supporting an open-ended and criminal war agenda. The fraudulent war on terror has taken the lives of millions and cost us trillions of borrowed dollars in my country. Our civic duty obliges us to resist the deception and enslavement to this criminal war agenda. Failure to resist is to betray our nation, our people, and our progeny. And the thing is that when you understand that the U.S. Anglo-American invasion of Iraq was a war crime, was a war of aggression, the Chilcot Inquiry in England has determined that. That was obvious to anybody who was paying attention. The war in Afghanistan is also a war of aggression. It was all based on, trumped up charges of their involvement in 9/11, which wasn't true. And because of our NATO alliance, that means if the United States goes into an illegal war, it drags with all of its allies, which is where, countries like Norway and Denmark get involved in these war crimes. So this is a very serious thing, and it affects all of us. This is my one-man protest at the Academy Awards in Hollywood, California. That's Hollywood, California, believe it or not. Glamorous place. This is the book I wrote, Solving 9/11, The Deception Changed the World. And I have this book. It's my analysis in a very brief, concise format. I have 10 copies with me, so they're outside after the presentation. I can sign them for you. My background is I was an investigative journalist working in Washington, D.C. when 9/11 happened. I had studied Middle Eastern history at the University of California, and my specialty was Israel and Palestine. And prior to all that, I grew up in a little town outside Chicago where I went through Boy Scouts. I was an Eagle Scout, and I got the God and Country Award. And this is a picture of me presenting evidence at the first citizens grand jury we had in the United States on 9/11 in Los Angeles in 2004. So why is 9/11 truth so important 15 years later? Well, likewise, why does the murder of President Kennedy still matter 53 years later? The murder of President Kennedy matters because it was a coup d'etat. The powers behind the assassination took control of the government and orchestrated the cover-up. And the man raising his hand here was one of the masterminds of the cover-up. And a coup d'etat that is kept secret in a democratic country means the succeeding government is illegitimate. The U.S. military involvement in Vietnam spanned a period of 20 years, but it spiked after they killed Kennedy. Kennedy actually wanted to take the troops out of Vietnam. The Kennedy assassination matters because the U.S. government continues to support the lies of the Warren Commission. That is, that one man killed President Kennedy all by himself. The Kennedy assassination matters because the mainstream media continues to support and even endorse the official version. And the assassination matters because when the government supports the lies about the murder of the president, it means that the powers who killed President Kennedy are still in charge to this very day. The American population has typically, historically, been of the opinion that others were involved. That's the light green line. So why does 9/11 truth matter? 15 years later, for the same reasons. The 9/11 truth matters because the government continues to lie about what happened to this very day, these being the two presidents we've had since 9/11. And 9/11 was a policy coup that brought us into the war on terror and a series of costly wars. This grisly photo is from Iraq. 9/11 truth matters because for 15 years, the controlled media has pushed a false narrative about 9/11 and the war on terror, all the while suppressing evidence that disproves the official myth. Again, the American people have not trusted the government. This question was asked, and the American public in 2002, 73% thought that the U.S. government was mostly lying or hiding something, being untruthful, dishonest. That increased in 2004, and in 2006 it went up over 80%. And when they found, this is a New York Times poll, when they found that only 16% thought the administration was telling the truth, they stopped polling. So our predicament in the United States, in a nutshell, is that if the U.S. government and media are lying to us about September 11th, it means they are controlled by the same people who carried out 9/11. That's a reasonable conclusion. So why do the government and the media cover up the truth about what happened on 9/11? First, to protect the real culprits from being identified, and two, to prevent the official myth from being exposed as a pack of lies, and three, to advance the fraudulent war on terror, the Zionist war agenda being waged by the United States, which was the primary reason for 9/11. Now here I come across this problematic word, Zionist. What does Zionist mean? Zionism means basically Jewish nationalism. That is a nation state of Israel for the Jewish people, and for the Jewish people alone. Zionism, of course, is based on this idea of a state in which Jews are the only ones that actually are enfranchised as citizens. So it's based on a notion of Jewish supremacy. So 9/11 was a highly sophisticated false flag terror atrocity designed to create shock and awe and to instill fear and rage in the population to compel U.S. public opinion to support an Israeli Zionist war agenda known as the global war on terror. And that's where we've been for the last 15 years. Starting the war on terror was the primary reason for the false flag terror attacks of 9/11. The war on terror is obviously based on the official myth of 9/11. This is an update from recently these terror attacks in Europe. The first photo is from Nice. The second one is from Berlin. These terror attacks happened about 10 days apart. And what was peculiar about this is that there was a fellow who was present at both attacks. His name was Richard Gutjahr, a German journalist. And he happened to be in Nice when the truck went down the Anglais, the promenade, and he was also present at the attack in Berlin, or in Munich, excuse me, about 2 weeks later. Very uncanny. The guy's in both places, and he's filming them and putting them online as they happen. What's equally uncanny is that his wife is a very high-level Israeli intelligence officer. Here's the relationship. There's Richard Gutjahr up there in the top, and he's described by Germans as being a propagandist. His wife down there below is Einat Wilf, who is formerly an advisor to Shimon Peres. She was a member of parliament in the party of Ehud Barak, and she is a lieutenant in Israel's signal intelligence agency known as Unit 8200, which is Israel's equivalent of NSA in America, Signals Intelligence. This shows you the Zionist connection that was going on in the Pentagon after 9/11. This is the Israeli chief of staff. His name is Shaul Mofaz. He's an Iranian guy. And he's meeting there in the Pentagon in January of 2002 with what we call the neocons. In this case, to his left is Paul Wolfowitz. Across the table is Dov Zakheim. And to his right is Douglas Feith. And these three men are Israel firsters. They're Zionists. They're Jewish, and they are active supporters of an aggressive policy in the Middle East. And here they are exchanging notes with Shaul Mofaz. At the time that this photo was taken, Mr. Wolfowitz was actually the assistant defense secretary under Rumsfeld. So, of course, the United States then, shortly after 9/11, 3 weeks later, invaded Afghanistan, as if Afghanistan had anything to do with 9/11. And the Afghanistan war is costing U.S. taxpayers $4 million per hour for a total of $738 billion since 2001. This is occupied Iraq. This is a concentration camp that the American military set up. They called it Camp Bucca. Camp Bucca was named after an American firefighter from New York who died on 9/11. What's interesting about this camp is that this was the catalyst of the terror group ISIS. The leadership people who run ISIS, Islamic State, all spent considerable periods of time in this camp. So what was on the agenda after 9/11? Well, General Wesley Clark, this man here, he informed the American people back in 2007 what he experienced after 9/11. And he said, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. One of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, we've made the decision, we're going to war with Iraq." "We're going to war with Iraq?" he said. "Why?" "I don't know," the general said. I came back a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" He said, "Oh, sir, it's much worse than that. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." Well, from that shopping list, from that prognosis, 5 of those countries have already been done. So we can see that this is pretty clearly what the agenda was. And what agenda is being carried out here is something called the Yinon Plan. Oded Yinon was a Likudnik Israeli military strategist who wrote this paper about how Israel's master plan would be constructed to dominate the Middle East. It was printed in a journal called Kivunim, a journal for Judaism and Zionism, in February 1982. And thanks to an Israeli scholar named Israel Shahak at Hebrew University, he translated this document into English for our benefit so we would understand what was the Israeli plan. And what the Israeli plan called for was basically something called Balkanization, breaking up the big Arab states into ethnic statelets, which is exactly what was done to Yugoslavia in the 1990s, if you recall. Yugoslavia was broken up into 6 or 7 mini-statelets based on ethnicity. And that's what's being done in Iraq. You see there, Iraq is now basically fragmented into 3. Syria is in the process of being broken up. Libya is now broken up. Sudan has been de facto or de jure broken up. So this is the name of the policy, the Yinon Plan. And as I said, it was articulated first in public in 1982. And the plan is basically, as I said, to break the states up along their ethnic confessional lines. So in the case of Iraq, you have the Shiites in the south, the Sunnis in the west, and the Kurds in the north. In this area in the north, Kurdistan, that's where the American military is now stationed with about 10,000 troops. That's also, by the way, the place where the Rothschild family owns the oil company. So what's going on here? This is the end game, or the recent game, of an Israeli policy, of a Zionist policy, which the American Joint Chiefs of Staff were fully aware of back in 1948 when before Israel was even a state. This quote is from one of the papers that they wrote, 13 papers on Zionism and what it would mean to the United States in 1948. This one's dated March 31st. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff, these are the highest brass in the U.S. military. They said Zionist strategy will seek to involve the United States in a continuously widening and deepening series of operations intended to secure maximum Jewish objectives. Well, what were those Jewish objectives? Besides settling Palestine and taking the land of Palestine, they included the expansion of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, into Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And 2, the establishment of Jewish military and economic hegemony over the entire Middle East. Well, I think the Joint Chiefs of Staff were pretty correct about this, because now, as we see now, since 9/11, the United States has been involved with NATO in Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and left those countries fragmented, destroyed, and seriously reduced in the quality of life. And now the country that's being targeted, obviously, is Syria. And what we know about Syria, is that this plan is being done in order to help the state of Israel. As Hillary Clinton said, she wrote this email back in 2012 when she was Secretary of State. And she wrote that the best way to help Israel is to use force, American force, in Syria to overthrow the government. So this email from 2012 reveals that the United States has been seeking to oust the Syrian government because it is in Israel's interest, not ours. There is no American interest whatsoever in Syria. I've been there several times. The United States and Syria have never had anything to do with each other. There's nothing there for us. Nothing there for, So it's being done to fragment and destroy that country. And here's the current Secretary of State. His name is John Forbes Kerry. And he said this in May of this year. He said he speaks not as an observer, not as a negotiator, but he sounds like he's the general calling the shots. He said if Assad's strategy is to somehow think he's going to just carve out Aleppo, the biggest city in the country, by the way, and just carve out a section of the country, I got news for you and for him. This war doesn't end. He said as long as Assad is there in power, the opposition is not going to stop fighting him one way or the other. Well, this doesn't sound like the words of a neutral observer, somebody who's negotiating for peace. This sounds like somebody who's putting out a warning. Now, I want to remind you that the government of Syria was last elected in June of 2014 in a multi-party election. Here's this poor boy from Aleppo. Now, when the Syrian civil war started in 2011, Barack Obama began efforts to overthrow the Assad government. Obama put the CIA in charge of operations, spending about $1 billion annually to arm anti-government forces in Syria. Well, therefore, you can see that the reason for this poor boy's plight is largely due to the actions and the operations of the U.S. government. If the U.S. government was not funding these militias, these terrorist militias in Syria, there wouldn't be a war. So here's the latest aspect of the war. This is the ISIS group. And the U.S. is spending now against ISIS $600,000 an hour. They spent over $11 billion fighting this ragtag army since June of 2014. One thing I want to point out here is that you see a lot of these characters wear ski masks. Why are they wearing ski masks? Because 25,000 of these people who are in this ISIS group are paid mercenaries. And they don't want their faces to be exposed because they have a career in Hollywood coming up or something. They have a life after this if they survive. Now, this is a very strange thing. This is May 2013, and this high-ranking senator from the state of Arizona, John McCain, who's a very big pro-Israel senator in the U.S. Congress, he went illegally into Syria and met with these leaders of this militia that were funding. And this character in the background here, right there, this guy lurking in the background, has been identified by Terry Masson, a French reporter that lives in Damascus, as being this person. This is when he lived, this is the same man. His name is al-Baghdadi, the Baghdadi. And this is when he was in Camp Bucca for 5 years. This is him, of course, here with the senator. And this is what he does nowadays. He's the head of ISIS. This is the wanted poster that was put out for him. Now, to confirm this, I called up the office of John McCain, and I said, can you tell me, because John McCain was photographed speaking tete-a-tete with this man, head-to-head. And I said, can you tell me, who is this man in the black shirt that John McCain is speaking to? And they said, well, they wrote back to me and said that he's a fighter in the Northern Front. And I said, you have to understand that's an inadequate answer. Are you telling me that President John McCain goes to Syria, sneaks into enemy territory, meets with this guy, has a conversation with him, and you don't know his name? So I have to assume that Terry Masson was correct. He looks very similar to that man. And here's just the U.S. Special Operations at work in in Syria today as we speak. We have an unknown number of troops fighting a war in Syria. And of course, the war on terror, the question is whether it's really a war against terror or it's a war of terror. Because terrorism has increased 4,500% since 9/11. And the frequency of terrorism is now 10 times greater in the places where we're fighting the war on terror, namely Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. So in 2015, they had more deaths than ever before in all three countries due to terrorism. So it's either extremely counterproductive or there's another agenda at play. And in the United States, terrorism is not a common cause of death, even with the massacre they had in Orlando and San Bernardino. But the United States government is spending $400 million per year per U.S. victim of terrorism. Compared to what they spend on cancer and influenza, you see that there's a huge amount of money we're spending on terrorism when it's not a leading cause of death. So what we're talking about is we're not talking about fighting terrorism, we're talking about criminal fraud. And here are the people behind the war on terror. This is the man who designed and constructed the lead advocate. His name is Benjamin Netanyahu. He's the current Prime Minister of the State of Israel. And this is a quote from a man named Alan Sabrowski, who was formerly with the U.S. Army War College. And in 2009, he wrote this article, and he said that the evidential trail for 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq runs from PNAC, Project for a New American Century, AIPAC and their cohorts, through the mostly Jewish neocons in the Bush administration, and back to the Israeli government. None of the denials and political machinations can alter that essential reality. And here's Mr. Netanyahu with Mr. Ehud Olmert in the background. These are both Likud politicians. Ehud Olmert here was the mayor of Jerusalem for a long time. He was deputy prime minister of Israel. And he was deputy prime minister of Israel and mayor of Jerusalem when he went to New York City on September 10th, 2001, and stayed there on September 11th, 2001. Yet his visit to New York City was kept completely out of the media. Why? I found out about it in the Jerusalem Post years later, that he had made a transaction in New York City on September 10th, meeting with these guys, and sold the Beitar football team. And then he came back, 10 days later, he came back to New York and basically held Giuliani's hand and said, this is, I'm here to help you and support you. But he never said, well, I was here at the time. I was here on September 10th. So it was kept secret. But why? Why would this high-ranking Israeli politician be in New York City on September 10th and 11th? And why would his visit be kept secret? This is another Israeli leader, prime minister, defense minister, chief of staff, Ehud Barak. And Ehud Barak appeared in the London studio of the BBC TV, BBC World, which is the largest English-speaking broadcaster in the world. And before either tower had fallen that day, both planes had struck, but the towers were still standing. He presented his analysis to the world. And he said, "The world will never be the same from today on," he said. He said, "We know who's behind this. This is the work of Osama bin Laden. And we know where bin Laden is. He's in Afghanistan." And he concluded saying, "It's time to launch an operational, concrete war against terror." And his little analysis that he presented on the BBC World then became the official myth of 9/11. And that's what we did. We went to war against terror. Now, what's the connection between Ehud Barak and Netanyahu? Well, Ehud Barak, with the sunglasses, was Netanyahu's commander in an organization called the Sayeret Matkal, an independent covert commando force of Israeli military intelligence, which takes its orders directly from the chief of staff. On September 11th, September 12th, the New York Times, the lead paper of New York, came out with this headline. And the headline is a very simple summation of the official story of 9/11, but it contains 3 falsehoods. It says, hijacked jets destroy Twin Towers. Well, we now know that hijacked jets did not destroy the Twin Towers. And it says that, and hit Pentagon in Day of Terror. We also know that those jets were not hijacked, but they were drones. And thirdly, we know that none of them, not any jet hit the Pentagon. There's no evidence, never has there been seen any evidence of any large body Boeing hitting the Pentagon. Now, that indicates that we're dealing with a very complex and sophisticated crime. And there was a man at the State Department who said it like this. His name was Larry Johnson, and he was the Deputy Director of Counterterrorism. He said, "We don't have anything in history to compare with this. The only thing that comes close to it is a former Soviet intelligence operation." Some people will criticize me and say, "Oh, Mr. Bollyn, you're picking on Israel. Israel would never do something like that to America. That's our special friend, our ally. We give them $4 billion a year. They must be our friend." Well, this is what they did to American intelligence ship back in 1967. During the Six-Day War, June 8th, 1967, Israeli unmarked jets, unlike this drawing by Mr. Dees, Israeli Mirage fighters attacked the ship. An Israeli torpedo ship put a torpedo into the side of the ship, killing 34 American spies, basically NSA guys. The ship was in international waters, and as the sailors tried to put life rafts into the water, the Israelis were machine gunning those life rafts, so they sunk. Now, we now know from transcripts that were released recently, last few years, that the Israelis knew full well that this was an American ship. The communications between the pilots and the ground control went something like this. The ground control in Tel Aviv said, "Identify the ship, identify the ship." And the pilot said, "It's American, American." Then the orders came from Tel Aviv, "Sink the ship, no survivors." Now that gives you some idea of the ruthlessness of the Israeli state when they see that it's in their strategic interest to do something like this or 9/11. They do it. So 9/11 is very much like the murder of Kennedy. These are some quotes from a Kennedy scholar about the Kennedy murder, but they're very appropriate for 9/11 as well. The first one goes like this: "All the time it was obvious, it was blatantly obvious that it was a conspiracy." And secondly, the cover story was transparent and designed not to hold, to fall apart at the slightest scrutiny. And here's what happened. Of course, the pulverization of the towers, 110 stories, huge buildings. Each building was about 1 acre. It's a large piece of land, and 4 inches of concrete in 20-gauge steel pans. All of that was pulverized instantaneously, well, within 10 seconds, and everything that was on those floors. You have to remember there were 2,700 people that were trapped in those buildings. There are like 1,000 people for whom not one piece has been found. Nothing. So the war on terror has cost the United States now more than $1.7 trillion. That's 1,000 billion. And that's just for the war fighting. When you calculate the cost of the veterans, their care, their psychological care, all that kind of care they're going to need for the rest of their lives, the calculation goes up to about $4 trillion. That's a lot of money. But wait just a minute. What is the war on terror? What is it all about? And where did it come from? When did Americans start acting like this? This is the kind of thing we used to read about growing up in America, reading about Stalinist Russia. that they had Gulag Archipelago, that they tortured people, that Stalin did all these terrible things. And now the Americans are doing it. Where did this come from? Well, the war on terror is basically an Israeli stratagem pushed by Netanyahu since 1979 to bring the U.S. military and allies into the Middle East to wage war on behalf of the Zionist state. Here's Netanyahu. His first book that he wrote after the conference he edited the book. He put the speech of George Bush in there. It's called International Terrorism, Challenges and Responses. The next book he wrote was Terrorism, How the West Can Win. Then Fighting Terrorism. And I read these books. I read most of them because I wanted to see what he would say about the Palestinians and why Israel was afflicted by terrorism. And he would say that the terrorists were Islamic terrorists and that they were attacking Israel because Israel is part of the West. And therefore, the West has to come and fight this war because really the West is the target. That's all baloney. But what he uses, when he uses the word terrorist, he uses it to delegitimize the Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. Now, of course, legally and morally, the Palestinians have every right to resist occupation of their land. That's their right. As, for example, when the Nazis invaded Denmark, the Danish people had every right, legally, morally, to take up arms against the Nazis. That's part of the deal. That's the way it goes. And here are these Palestinians trying to defend their country from Israeli military. Of course, they have no arms, no significant arms. So 22 years after it was born in the Jerusalem Conference in July 1979, the war on terror became operational with the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. The ultimate purpose of 9/11 was to start the war on terror. And on 9/11, the New York Times interviewed Mr. Netanyahu and asked, how will this atrocity affect Israeli-American relations? And Mr. Netanyahu said, right away, it's very good. He said, well, it's not very good, but it'll generate immediate sympathy. Now, on the day of 9/11, the number of people who were thought to have been killed ranged between 20,000 and 30,000. That's how many people they thought were dead in the rubble. It later came down to 3,000. But who would say about such an atrocity that it's very good, except somebody who saw some benefit from the atrocity itself? And he saw a benefit. A few years later, he's speaking in Israel, speaking at Bar-Ilan University, a Hebrew-speaking university. He's speaking about the Israelis, and he said in Hebrew, we are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq. I want to point out that Mr. Netanyahu has been the chairman of the Likud coalition since 1993. And he had a very interesting relationship with Mr. Silverstein. Now, Netanyahu is the godfather of the war on terror. This is the godfather of 9/11 destruction in New York City. This man, Larry Silverstein, owned all three buildings. He had 100-year leases on the 2 towers, and he owned Building 7. These are the 3 towers that all fell down that day. And as the Haaretz newspaper in Israel reported in November of 2001, for years, Netanyahu and Silverstein have kept in very close touch. Every Sunday afternoon, New York time, Netanyahu would call Silverstein. It made no difference where Netanyahu was, he would always call. Their ties continued after Netanyahu became prime minister in 1996. So you can see that they had this ongoing relationship over a period of almost a decade or more. Now, how did Larry Silverstein get the World Trade Center towers? That's very important, because the World Trade Center towers were actually like public property. They were owned by an institution called the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a public body. Well, what they did is Ronald Lauder, this very high-level Zionist, he's the son of Estee Lauder, he was put in charge of a privatization scheme in New York State under Governor Pataki. So he decided what they would privatize. So he decided they would privatize the World Trade Center. Then it went to this man here, Lou Eisenberg, who was the chairman of the board of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And he then oversaw the negotiations that delivered the World Trade Center to this man. Now, the details are very strange here. This man didn't have the money to put down for the World Trade Center. He borrowed $100 million from GMAC, a General Motors bank, which went bankrupt in 2008. Now, but there's a funny story here. I can't go into detail, but these two men are both members of the board of directors of this organization down here, UJA Federation of New York. This is the same group of people that came out and protested against me in Brooklyn the other day. It's the funding arm for the state of Israel, where they collect money in New York and across the United States to help Israel. He was the national chairman. He was on the board of planning. So through their Zionist back channel, the property got sent and wound up in his hands. This is the day that he got the towers. He got the keys to the front door there. He's with his lawyer and his wife and his children. And he said, on July 24th, 2001, about 5 weeks before 9/11, he said, I am proud to assume the stewardship of the World Trade Center, one of New York's greatest jewels. And under Larry's stewardship, 5 weeks later, the towers looked like this. And people who removed this rubble said that all that was left was steel and dust. The war on terror. This is the evolution of the Israeli stratagem known as the global war on terror. It started with this man. It started with, his man is Menachem Begin, and he was born in Russia in 1913, came to Palestine in 42, became the leader of the Irgun, and then ordered the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946. Then he created Likud in 1973 and became prime minister in 1977 and promptly invaded Lebanon. This is the emblem of his organization called the Irgun. You see in the background, there's this larger map of Israel called Eretz Israel. It means the land of Israel. And it says in Hebrew there, Rak Kach, only thus, only by the gun will they achieve this larger territory they aspire to. And here's from a modern Israeli article called What Israel's Future Borders Will Look Like on an Israeli website. They aspire to, the blue stripes on the Israeli flag stand for the Nile River and the Euphrates River, and then the Rothschild star in the middle, the Rothschild star in the middle. And here's another Rothschild employee. This is David Ben-Gurion. He was the first prime minister of Israel. And you can see by what he told his general staff in 1948 that Israel had already aspirations to a much larger state. He said, we should prepare to go over on the offensive with the aim of smashing Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. He said, the weak point is Lebanon. We'll overthrow that, establish a Christian state in the south. And if Syria gets in the way, we'll bomb them, and we'll bomb Egypt as well. I want to point out one thing. The new Israeli defense minister is named Avigdor Lieberman. He's born in the Soviet Union. He's a pretty nasty piece of work. But he's publicly stated that if Egypt gets into a war with Israel, Israel should bomb the Aswan Dam. Now, if Israel were to bomb the Aswan Dam, that would mean basically mass murder of tens of millions of people downriver. And yet, no politician in Europe or America has the gumption to stand up against such genocidal statements. And this is to give you some idea of how extreme the current Israeli government is. It's far, far to the right of anything we've seen in Europe in a long time. So this is the handiwork of Menachem Begin. In 1946, he blew up the King David Hotel there, and 93 people were killed. It was the worst act of terrorism in Israeli-Palestinian history. This is the former president of Israel, Shimon Peres. He had a stroke the other day. I don't know if he's still alive. He's in bad shape. But after the Lavon affair, when Israeli intelligence tried to do false flag bombings in Egypt in 1954, the prime minister of Israel made these comments about Shimon Peres. He said, Peres shares the same ideology as Lavon. He wants to frighten the West into supporting Israel's aims. And that's exactly where we are today. All this terrorism that occurs in Europe and the United States is meant to scare you into supporting this aggressive war policy in the Middle East. And that war policy is not Danish policy or American policy, it's Zionist policy. Here's Menachem Begin. He was interviewed by a British journalist in 1974 who asked him, how does it feel, in light of all that's going on, to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And Begin said, in the Middle East? He said, in all the world. Putting on himself the mantle of being the father of terrorism in all the world. And he wasn't exaggerating. Here it was when he took power in 1977, became prime minister of the state of Israel, and promptly invaded South Lebanon. And Israel invaded this territory in 1978 and remained there until 2002 when Hezbollah pushed them out. But what they intended to do was to establish, what Israel wanted to do was establish a Christian state to the north of the Litani River up here and keep this part for itself. This is also known as Upper Galilee. Here's the leaders, the three leaders of the Likud. This is Begin in the middle, Shamir on the right, and Ariel Sharon on the left. And what the Shamir's gang was called the Lehi, or the Stern gang. They were even more extreme. They killed the United Nations mediator in Palestine in 1948, a Swedish count named Folke Bernadotte. I think he's the uncle of the current king. He was the king's uncle. And this group, the Shamir group, murdered him, Bonnie and Clyde style. They put a machine gun in his window and machine gunned him in the back of the seat along with a French colonel. They did that because the United Nations had sent Volker Bernadotte to Israel, to Palestine, to try and find a solution to this Jewish problem with a war broke out. As soon as the United Nations partitioned Palestine, war broke out immediately, and the Israelis went and took everything. And in the process of taking everything, they expelled like 700,000 Palestinians. And he said, Volker Bernadotte said, the only way we can have peace in this region is if the Palestinians are allowed to go home. Now, this is anathema to the Zionists, like him, so they killed him. He later went on to become prime minister, the Shamir. And in that gang that killed Volker Bernadotte was this man's father. You might not know this man. This is Rahm Emanuel. He's the mayor of my hometown of Chicago now. He was the special advisor to President Clinton for 8 years. And then he became the first person selected by Barack Obama as chief of staff. And Sherman Skolnick of Chicago, an expert on these kinds of things, always referred to him as being Mossad's agent in the White House. And as you can see, there's no term limits on them. So now I'm going to talk about the Israeli ideation of 9/11. Ideation is the same sort of thing that we were speaking about before, this predictive programming. Putting an idea out there in the media so the public gets the idea that this is something in the air, something might happen. In 1978, this is 1 year after the Likud came to power, this Israeli agent named Arnon Milchan made this movie called The Medusa Touch, in which a giant 747 flies into the Pan Am building. And as you can see, the same year he made the film, he's very close to the Israeli defense minister there, Ezer Weizman, same year. And here he's preparing the props for the show, for the movie. And then in 2000, he made a similar movie in which a large Boeing is flown into the World Trade Center. Now, he made this film with his business partner, Rupert Murdoch. They have a company together called Regency Films, and they made this is called The Lone Gunman. It was a spin-off, half-an-hour show, a spin-off of the X-Files. And in the film, this is a large Boeing aircraft. It's flying right into the World Trade Center. But at the very last minute, the pilot regains control and narrowly misses hitting the World Trade Center by inches. But this appeared on TV. This was shown on TV in March 2001, basically 6 months before 9/11 happened. And 10 million people watched it. And here's the man that made that movie. Here he is with his two buddies. He's sitting with Shimon Peres there and Bibi Netanyahu. And he's considered to be, Arnon Milchan is considered to be Israel's, or the wealthiest, second wealthiest man in Hollywood, worth $5.2 billion. But he has a long history of being a money launderer as well. So where does the money come from? And I want to point out that he was the lead agent in a secret Israeli organization called Lakam, which was involved in smuggling nuclear components for nuclear weapons from America to Israel. And he was captured. His company was caught red-handed sending 850 nuclear triggers to Israel. The FBI found out about it. They told Israel, give them back. Israel said, we'll give them half back. And they kept 450 for themselves. And his company was the one that did the smuggling. And this Lakam organization, just to give you an idea, Lakam, L-A-K-A-M, was so secret, even the Mossad didn't know about it. I find that hard to believe, but that's what they say. Now, here again we have the man who's behind the war on terror, the lead advocate of this idea. He's with his father. This is about 1979. Now, prior to this, in 1976 to 1978, Benjamin Netanyahu worked for the Rothschild company called Boston Consulting in Boston, New York, in Boston, United States. And then in 1979, he went back to Israel and created an organization called the Netanyahu Institute on International Terrorism. And they had a conference in July of that year in which they rolled out onto the world stage this idea of fighting a global war on terror. And George Bush spoke at that event on the third final day. And then in 1980, the head of the Mossad made this prediction. In 1980, 21 years before 9/11, he said this. He was asked by this American Zionist, do you think terrorism will come to America? And if so, where and why? And he goes on saying, yeah, it'll come to you, believe me. And when asked where, he said, New York City is the symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely they will strike the Empire State Building, your tallest building, and a symbol of your power. Amazing. So 21 years before 9/11 happens, this man has this uncanny prediction that that's exactly what's going to happen on 9/11. And he's the former head of the Mossad, first head of Shin Bet, and former head of Haganah intelligence. So he knew what he was talking about. And what happened then is that he went from dream to reality. Two of his lead agents, these two men, went to New York and tried to get the security contract for the World Trade Center. This top man is Zvi Malkin, and this guy down here is Avraham Shalom Ben-Dor. And they represented a company called Atwell Security of Tel Aviv. And they approached the World Trade Center and the Port Authority, and they actually got the contract for the security in 1987. But when it was discovered by the Port Authority that this man down below, the president of the company, was a convicted murderer in Israel, they tore up the contract. Had they not done that, 9/11 probably would have happened in the late 1980s or early 1990s, and we would have been in really bad shape because we didn't have the internet. The internet has been the thing that has given us the advantage, or at least a fighting chance in understanding what's going on in our world. Well, they were thwarted. The Port Authority tore up the contract, but then they went to work for this guy. They went to work for Jules Kroll. Although the Israelis had been rebuffed, they went to work for Jules Kroll, who had a company in the World Trade Center. He was a business partner with this man. This is Maurice Greenberg of AIG. These two men had a company together called Kroll Associates, and after the first bombing in 1993 in the basement of the World Trade Center, about 8 people died. Kroll Associates, his company, got the contract for the security of the World Trade Center. And at that time already, that Israeli guy, Shalom Ben-Dor, was working for him. So using an American Jew as a Trojan horse, they got into the World Trade Center in a position to be in charge of security, where they can make the recommendations. And the Port Authority said that everything that Kroll Associates recommended after 1993, they did. They thought it was wonderful. So they changed all the procedures. And then in 1982, of course, the Israelis invaded South Lebanon, and they went up to the Litani River, and the Americans were sent in under Ronald Reagan to hold the line. This was the first time that American troops went in to kind of like hold an Israeli line. They were sent as peacekeepers, but there was no peace to be kept. It was an occupied country. And then, of course, there was this bombing in the Beirut barracks in 1983. There's a whole story of that, too. The Israelis, Mossad, they knew exactly the color of the truck, the make of the truck, where the bomb was being made, the license plate number of the truck, but they didn't tell the Americans anything except a truck bomb may be coming your way soon. And the head of the Israeli Mossad at the time, Aharoni, he said, he told in the book Beyond Way of Deception by Ostrovsky, he said, America's a big country. They can take care of themselves. Just give them the skimpiest evidence, skimpiest information. And so 241 Americans paid with their lives. Now, after they created this war on terror construct, you need to have an enemy. You need to have a boogeyman. You need to have a real enemy with a face. So that opportunity came with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The United States began arming the Mujahideen, the fighters. And it went this way. There was a congressman named Charlie Wilson who was very pro-Israel. He got elected to Congress in 1973. When he went to Congress, he became befriended by the head of Israeli intelligence in Mossad in Washington, station chief. And they worked together, and they came up with this idea of arming the Mujahideen with American weapons or with weapons so they could fight the Red Army. That's all good. So they set up this operation. But in this operation, they had the usual suspects. The United States, CIA, and Saudi Arabia were providing the money. Pakistan provided the land, the ground, where the Afghans were. And Israel provided the weapons and the training. Israeli military intelligence. Now, the strange thing is that the Americans were supporting the most notoriously anti-Western group out there. This group by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. This was the leader. Now, this guy couldn't fight a battle to save his life. He never won a battle against the Soviet Union the whole time he was in Afghanistan, when he was fighting. He stirred up the problems with all the other Mujahideen groups, and he was anti-Western. Why would the United States CIA and the Israelis, why would they be funding a group that was incompetent, stirring up the problems, and anti-Western? It makes no sense unless you can understand that what they were really doing is they were creating the enemy for the next war. They were creating that enemy. And that's what they did. And the situation was very interesting, that this is the Mossad station chief in Washington. His name is Zvi Rafia. And if you read Charlie Wilson's War, the book, you'll see that he used Charlie Wilson's office as if it were his own office, his congressional office. And the quote is from the book. bottom left corner says, Rafia always acted as if he owned Wilson's office. One of the staffers kept a list of people he needed to lobby. He would use the phones, give projects to the staff, and call on Charlie to intervene whenever he needed him. So who's the alpha dog here? Who's the lead dog? It looks like Mr. Rafia. And what they did is they got these Arabs to come and join the war, and these Arabs are called Afghan Arabs. The most famous of them is, of course, this man here, Osama bin Laden, a long CIA operative. And these characters went from Arabic countries to join the Mujahideen fighters in Pakistan. And these guys were trained by Israeli military intelligence. And at the time, he came in 1983-84. In 1984, he became closely tied to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. This is the group that was being trained and funded and armed by Israeli military intelligence. And the person who ran military intelligence at that time in Israel, good old Ehud Barak. Here he is saying goodbye to Ariel Sharon after he'd been decommissioned for his role in the Sabra and Shatila massacre. And here's the Israeli agent, the Egyptian, who's a Hebrew-speaking double agent, who trained Osama bin Laden. His name's Ali Mohammed, and he was Osama bin Laden's first trainer. And he trained all the guys that became Al-Qaeda. Al-Zawahiri, bin Laden. And he also, he went to Nairobi by himself and set up a cell in Nairobi, and that cell is the cell that blew up the American embassies in Nairobi and in Tanzania. And as a result of this, this guy had been trained in American military bases in Fort Bragg, Carolina, in Arizona, and this guy, it seems like his career was greased with butter. He just went right straight to the top. Well, then he went straight to an American court. He went to the federal court, and he was held responsible for the bombing of the embassies in Africa. And he was put in jail for like 1,000 years, or his life. And then he disappeared. He just disappeared from an American federal penitentiary, never to be seen again. Amazing. And he trained these guys. And when the group that he trained, that the Israelis trained, this cadre, this cell, the major cell, this group became Al-Qaeda and Taliban in 1994. So that's where the whole ISIS thing, that's where the whole Islamic State, that's where the whole Al-Qaeda comes from. It comes from the group that the Americans and the Saudis and the Israelis created, cultivated, and infiltrated in 1982, 83, 84, and 85. Now, in America, there was also this kind of ideation, putting out the idea that catastrophic terrorism was going to come to us and it's going to come soon. This is from the Foreign Affairs magazine, December 1998. And this was a three-man group that had a catastrophic terrorism study group. And they printed their report, was in this magazine in December 1998. And you can see that in the first subtitle, they were imagining the transforming event. And they talk about how this catastrophic terrorism is going to come to America and it's going to change everything. And when it does, this is what you should do. And that's what we got. They said here, catastrophic terrorism has moved from far-fetched horror to a contingency that could happen next month. Yeah, it took 2 years, but it came. And here are the men that wrote the report. The first one is Philip Zelikow. He became the person who wrote the 9/11 Commission report. Then the two other people were Ashton Carter and John Deutsch. Ashton Carter is this man here. He's now Secretary of Defense. And this guy, he was the Belgian-born guy who became head of the CIA. Now, this is when they wrote that report, they worked for this company called Global Technology Partners, which is an exclusive affiliate of Rothschild North America. It's designed to get acquisitions on the gravy train, to get some of that money that's spent. Because you have to understand, in the United States of America, we spend more money on war than anything else. From our tax dollar, 55 cents of every tax dollar goes for war. The rest is what we survive on. So it's pretty slim pickings. So that means that the American Defense Secretary that we now have has spent his entire life working for the Rothschild family. So he's basically a paid employee of the Rothschilds. And here's another group that was planning for something terrible to happen. This is the Project for a New American Century. The people that run it were the Kagan family down here, Lithuanian-born man, his two sons, and his wife. This is Robert Kagan's wife. Her name is Victoria Nuland. She's the person who brought us the war in Ukraine single-handedly. But this group, the Project for a New American Century, came out with an article in a paper in September 2000, 1 year before 9/11, in which they talked about how the United States military would have to become engaged in the Middle East and around the world on a very proactive, preemptive basis. And they said the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Well, that's what we got. 9/11 was the Pearl Harbor. And 9/11, as you can see, was the event that then made real all these plans, all these projects, all these predictions became real with this attack. So there's a long history to understand. And I said, Barack then said, now is the time to launch an operational concrete war against terror. And George Bush said, we were attacked because our way of life, it was under attack. He said, America is targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. I guess the terrorists never heard of Switzerland. And then a few days later, Bush declared war on terror in front of the U.S. Congress, saying that every nation and every region has a decision to make. Either you are with us or are you with the terrorists. So even in the capitals of Oslo and Stockholm and Copenhagen, your foreign policy leaders had to say, hey, which side are we on? Are we on the terrorist side? Or are we on Bush's side? And I want to point out one thing. This is a little story. This man here was the Speaker of the House. He was in number 3. After the president, vice president, if they die, he becomes president. Now this man is from my home state of Illinois, and as we now know, he was paying a lot of his money to silence people in Illinois, young men in Illinois who he had molested. He'd been a pedophile. He'd been a wrestling coach in a high school, and he had been a bit groping and molesting young men, and he went straight to the top U.S. House of Representatives. Now, I'm just pointing this out because the FBI discovered this. He was paying millions of dollars to keep these people silent. This is the way it works in America. You often have politicians who have a very secret vice or a very secret history they want to keep hidden, criminal, vice, something. And in order to do so, they are willing to do what they're told in order to keep their secret secret. The Clinton family is no different. The Clinton family, the Bush family, they're all together tied in something called Iran-Contra. It goes back a long way, where Israel was the main player. Israel was the one who ran Iran-Contra. But the Bush family was involved, with Vice President Bush in the White House, and Governor Clinton in Arkansas. So they say, nothing ties people more closely together than a crime committed together. So when this whole election thing started in America, we had 2 choices, Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton. Oh, thanks a lot. What a choice. So here's the latest phase on the war on terror, is fighting Islamic State. Now, in 2014, the Site Intelligence Group, an Israeli intelligence outfit, released an ISIS beheading video before the group itself had released the video. This is the way it went. She's on CNN. She's explaining that within a short time after our release, ISIS account on social media indicated that within a short time they would be releasing the video, only we actually had the video beforehand and were able to beat them with the release. This is her. It's a one-man operation. She's an Israeli woman named Rita Katz. She's based in Bethesda, Maryland, right outside Washington, D.C., and she releases the videos to her subscribers before the bad guys in Iraq have released the video at all. Well, how does she have a copy of the video beforehand? If nothing else, this shows that there's a very close relationship between Israeli intelligence and ISIS. And ISIS is, in fact, the acronym for Israeli Secret Intelligence Services. That's their English acronym. Now, SITE is, as I said, it stands for Search for International Terrorist Entities, provides intelligence about terrorist groups to a wide range of paying clients, including military and intelligence agencies from the United States. And when they killed this guy in Syria the other day, the Israelis had said about him. He had made these predictions, or he had made these threats to Europe. Adnani had said, "We will strike you in your homeland," calling on Muslims to kill Europeans, especially the spiteful and filthy French. Smash his head with a rock, or slaughter him with a knife, or run him over with your car, he said, according to SITE Intelligence Group. So I'm showing you that this, and here they produced this video, they distributed this video, which is clearly fraudulent. This is not Osama bin Laden. This is one of his body doubles. This is one of the fakes. Again, they released this before it had even been released by the Al-Qaeda people. Again, another one. And when there was the shooting in Orlando, at the nightclub in Orlando, a couple days later, the Israeli Prime Minister went and made a video to explain what had happened in Florida, as if he knew. But if you listen to what he says, you'll understand how he draws us closer together, Israel and the West, and ties us at the hips. He says, this week's shooting wasn't merely an attack on the LGBT community. It was an attack on all of us, on our common values of freedom and diversity and choice. Radical Islamist terror makes no distinction between shades of infidel. This week it was gays in Orlando. A few days before it was Jews in Tel Aviv. All of us are targets. Working together, we will defeat them even faster. And this is how this is the money that America has spent in fighting this war on terror since 2001. $1.7 trillion. All borrowed money. So the 9/11 cover-up is essentially part of the deception that has enabled the culprits to deceive the American public into supporting the global war on terror, which was, after all, the goal of the 9/11 terror atrocity. As President Nixon said, it's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. Because in the cover-up goes on and on and on. Now, 15 years, people who are involved in the cover-up, they show their hands. You can see who they are. There are three essential elements that have to be covered up. You have to control the investigation and access to the evidence. You have to control the interpretation, how the event is explained to the public. That's the media control. America media is very controlled. And lastly, you have to control the litigation, the court process, in order to prevent legal discovery from coming out in a court of law. The first aspect is the controlled investigation, or more to the point, the non-investigation. 3,000 people were killed in broad daylight on 9/11, but there was no criminal investigation. All the evidence was destroyed. Because what the government did, they said, well, the Pentagon got hit. The Pentagon is a military fort. Therefore, this is an act of war. And as an act of war, we're going to go to war against the people who committed the crime and let's clean up Wall Street. So that's what they did. The men that should have investigated the crime as a crime were these two men, the Attorney General, Ashcroft, and his assistant, Michael Chertoff, an Israeli national. Michael Chertoff's mother was one of the first Mossad agents. Her name was Levia Eisen, and she was involved in bringing the Yemenite Jews up to Israel back in 1949. Then she came to America with her rabbi husband, Baruch, and they had their child born in America. But he spent a lot of his childhood in Israel, speaks fluent Hebrew and all that. And he was given the task of investigating 9/11. It was his obligation to prosecute any criminal activity. But the FBI, which serves right below him, destroyed the evidence, confiscated the evidence, and destroyed it. So there was no investigation. No investigation, no trial. And then after that, after the non-investigation, he was promoted and made head of Homeland Security, in which position he maintained his control over all the evidence of 9/11 for almost a decade. Now, the 9/11 Commission was clearly a cover-up. And this is the senior counsel for the 9/11 Commission. He spoke out on the record after his time on the commission. He said, what the government and military officials told Congress, the commission, the media, and the public about who knew what when was almost entirely and inexplicably untrue. And these are the two co-chairmen. They said, to this day, we don't know why NORAD told us what they told us. It was just so far from the truth. This is the man that wrote the report. This is Philip Zelikow. He was executive director of the report, and he actually wrote the report. See, in March 2003, Philip Zelikow had completed the outline for the 9/11 Commission report before the staff even began working. And this man has a PhD from Rice University in Texas, I think, and the title of his PhD was On the Creation and Maintenance of the Public Myth. And that's what he wrote. This is another man, this is Gene Corley. He was involved in writing this report about how the buildings performed up until the point of collapse. And he was from Chicago, and he was, I called him up after he started this, and I asked him, Mr. Corley, are you investigating the steel for evidence of explosions? And he said, I know nothing about that. He said, I'm not a metallurgist. So the question is, why was he put in charge of investigating the collapse of the two largest steel frame buildings in the world? Probably for the same reason that he was put in charge of the Waco investigation, Waco, Texas, and Oklahoma City bombing. Because he's very good at making a report that will support the government version of events. A cover-up guy. This is another one of the guys cover-up. He oversaw the writing of the report on the collapse of the World Trade Center, in which they did not even look for evidence of explosions or molten metal. And then he went on to become the head of a group called Stanford Research Institute, which develops nanotechnology, nanothermite for the U.S. forces, U.S. military, in a place called Menlo Park, California. And what's interesting, in the laboratory where they make nanocomposite materials, the laboratory has been managed by an Israeli guy, this fellow here, since 1984 in California. And here's another master of the cover-up. This is the mayor of New York. His name is Michael Bloomberg. He served an unprecedented 12 years. Now that's very important because New York was epicenter of the whole thing. And there were a lot of people who were very, very sick from inhaling the dust, etc., the smoke. And so he was in position to suppress all that testimony from coming out into the public. And here he is meeting with Ehud Barak at Christmas 2008 when Barak was bombing Gaza in something called Operation Cast Lead. What he was also dropping was white phosphorus, which burns right through a human body. And here's Mr. Netanyahu with Mr. Mayor Bloomberg. And here's Bloomberg showing Netanyahu around the World Trade Center where they created this memorial. And Netanyahu wanted to see the names of the 4 Israelis who died that day, which is a very low number considering that 4,000 were expected to have been at work that day. That's according to the Jerusalem Post. Next thing is controlling the interpretation. Now, how do you control interpretation in a democratic country? You control the media. And this is the media mogul who owns a company called Fox Corporation or News Corp. His name is Rupert Murdoch. And he came from Australia in the early 1980s to the United States, and he bought up the media from coast to coast. And so in 2003, he owned 160 newspapers in America. And it's interesting that in that time, in 2003, when the United States was prepared to go into a war of aggression against Iraq, every editor of every one of those papers agreed with Murdoch on the need to go to war with Iraq. Now, there was no reason to go to war with Iraq. It was clearly a war of aggression. But this is how Mr. Murdoch was created by the Rothschild money. Murdoch didn't have the kind of money to come to America and buy 160 newspapers. It came from the Rothschilds. And the Rothschilds, the banksters like that, create media moguls in order to control public opinion. And in America, as I said, we now have consolidation in the media that's very dangerous. And I want to point out these guys are business partners in all kinds of things. They're business partners. This is Jacob Rothschild. The Rothschild family owns the oil of northern Iraq in a place called Kurdistan. They own the largest oil company there since 2002. And together, these guys, along with a few other tasty guys like Cheney, Woolsey, and Summers, and Richardson, they own the oil in the Golan Heights. Now, the Golan Heights is, of course, occupied Syrian territory. But if Syria ceases to exist, there's nobody there to complain anymore. It's ours. And that's where they're going with this. That's why it's an all-out game to destroy the government of Syria and destroy Syria as a nation. There's money to be made. This is the New York Times. They had this very strange editorial. 3 years after 9/11, they wrote this editorial. Now, the New York Times is a family-owned paper. It's owned by the Sulzberger Ox family, which is one of the leading B'nai B'rith families of New York City. And in September 11, 2004, they said, in the 3 years since 9/11, we've begun to understand that it's possible to know what happened without knowing what happened. How's that for media? That's the position they're saying. And they said some of what we need to know publicly has been provided by the report of the 9/11 Commission. Other answers are lacking, like what happened to this building. This is the 47-story building known as WTC-7 that fell directly down into its footprint at 5:23 in the afternoon on 9/11. It had a few sporadic office fires in there. It had been affected by the collapses, but then suddenly it fell straight down into its footprint at free fall speed. Demolition. And the last aspect of creating the interpretation is the legacy. Now, in New York City, at Ground Zero, they've created this museum, big shopping mall with Gucci bags and things like that. And they've got this fountain and in the footprint of the towers. That was all designed by this Israeli guy here. The World Trade Center Memorial was designed by an Israeli, Michael Arad. He's the son of Moshe Arad, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States of America. So they've kept this all kind of like within the Zionist circle of friends. If you don't believe the official account of 9/11, you're in good company because 60% of the American people do not believe it. Now, the third aspect is controlling the litigation. And the litigation is controlled by this judge. His name is Alvin K. Hellerstein. He's an Orthodox Jewish judge in the U.S. District Court of Manhattan. And he oversaw the 9/11 tort litigation, where there were 96 families left who didn't take the government money, who wanted to have their day in court to find out who had messed up and who was responsible for the loss of their father or their son or their husband or wife. So those 96 people wound up in a court of law, about as many as you, and one by one, those cases were settled out of court until there was no one left standing. I call that a judicial war of attrition, because the judge and the court are there, and at the end of the day, everybody else is gone. So there was no trial for 9/11. There never will be a trial for 9/11 unless we have some sort of revolution or something, because all the people who had legal standing have been settled out of court. And I discovered that that judge had a conflict of interest. A very serious conflict of interest is a primary family conflict. That is, his son lives in Israel, and his son Joseph is a lawyer for the parent company of ICTS, NV, which is based in Holland. It's a Mossad El Al company, Airport security. You probably all remember in Europe in the 1980s, you suddenly got these characters that showing up in airports in Europe who were asking all the questions the Israelis used to ask at security. And I would ask these guys in Frankfurt or Paris, God, you guys are just like the Israelis. We are the Israelis, they said. Because airport security in Europe was turned over to Israeli security back in the 80s, El Al Security. And this company, ICTS, was a defendant in the 9/11 tort litigation because they ran security in Boston on 9/11, and Newark, and Dulles, etc. So they were responsible. Their airport security, their passenger screening operations are what failed that day and let the bad guys get on the plane. If the bad guys even got on the plane, they would have had to explain all of this in a court of law. But the judge said, you're just the parent company. I don't see why you're here. You can go home. And that was the end of the trial. Now, the first 2,900 families had been given money by this man here, Kenneth Feinberg, special master. He doles out all the taxpayers' money. And when you take that money, you sign a bottom line, non-disclosure. You cannot talk about it, anything, how much you got, what the terms are. If you do, you'll be criminally prosecuted. The last 96 families dealt with Sheila Birnbaum, this woman here. These are both very high-level Zionist players in the United States of America. The first one, his wife is on the board of governors of the Jewish Agency, and she down here works for a law firm with very close ties to the state of Israel. And with these two people doling out the money, they closed down the entire litigation. So there will never be a trial in the United States. Another guy who is involved in this litigation is this judge, Michael Mukasey. He belongs to the same congregation as Judge Hellerstein in New York. He oversaw the 1993 bombing. Now that's important to understand. The 1993 bombing was done in order to convince Americans that Arabs were trying to blow down the World Trade Center. So they even made a movie in which at the end of the movie, they got the bad Arab in the back of the car. He's scowling. They're driving past the World Trade Center. He sees the two towers. He says, next time, we'll bring them both down. So that's to impress on the American people that Arabs are trying to blow down the World Trade Center, blow it up. So that when it actually did happen in 2001, people said, oh yeah, the Arabs did it. Didn't you see the movie? And he also oversaw, this judge also oversaw Larry Silverstein's negotiations, litigation with the insurance company, whereby Larry Silverstein got paid $7.2 billion for a down payment of $100 million of borrowed money. That's quite a bonus. So what are they covering up? The government and media are suppressing 9/11 evidence that would expose the official myth as a pack of lies in order to protect the real culprits from being identified. I was writing from my hometown in Chicago about 9/11, and I saw from day one that this was a big hoax. This was we were getting a false story. So I started writing in my little newspaper in Washington about how we were being lied to and the evidence of the falsehoods. And I said to myself, this can't be very safe. Here I am pointing out the lies of the government story, and the government media are pushing the people into war. And when the country goes to war, it kind of loses its mind. I said, this is probably not a safe place to be. So we should probably go to Europe. And so my wife and myself and our two little kids, after Thanksgiving, at the end of November, we went to Germany. And I relocated myself in Berlin for a while, and I wrote as a foreign correspondent. And I happened to have the good luck of knowing a German journalist who put me in touch with former German intelligence chiefs. And the first one I spoke to, he said, he looked at September 11th, he looked at the pictures, and he said, it looks like a Hollywood production. Then the next one said, this Wertebach told me, the deathly precision and magnitude of planning behind the 9/11 attacks would have needed years of planning. He said such a sophisticated operation would require the fixed frame of a state intelligence organization. Now, what state are we talking about? Then I met this man, Andreas von Bülow. This picture was taken 10 years later after I met him the first time. And he told me something very interesting. He was a parliamentarian in charge of the German intelligence. And he said that there are 3 levels to such an operation. There's the architectural level, the managerial level, and the working level. And he said that you don't get the upper echelon, the architectural structure, which masterminds such attacks in the first place. This level, the organization doing the planning, such as Mossad, which he mentioned by name, he said is primarily interested in affecting public opinion. Now, the funny thing is that I asked him, who do you think's behind this? And he said, Mossad. And I wrote the article and I sent it back to Washington. It got printed. And he was a little bit shocked. He said he told the same thing to every German journalist who came to him, but it was never published in German magazines because you can't say such things in Germany. It's forbidden. And then he said that the terrorists who actually commit the crimes are part of the working level, these 19 Arabs. And he said that working level is part of the deception. He went on to say that 95% of the work of intelligence agencies around the world is deception and disinformation, which is widely propagated in the mainstream media, creating an accepted version of events, just like we got on 9/11. He said journalists don't even raise the simplest questions. Those who differ are labeled as crazy. When I was in Britain in 2005, BBC interviewed me and they said, why are you the only American journalist who doesn't believe the official version? And I said, I don't know if that's true, but if it is, it's because other journalists who have raised those questions were fired. They were fired from their jobs. So here are these 19 guys who supposedly hijacked the planes that day. What's interesting about these guys is that 15 of them lived in the same little town in Florida, Hollywood, Florida, and that many of them, at least 6 of them, had duplicate licenses. So they went to get a license on Tuesday. They went to DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles, in Florida, got their license. Then the next day, somebody in their name called up and said, hello, DMV, this is Muhammad Atta. I just moved to a new apartment and I need a license with my new address on it. Can you send me my license, please, to this address? And they would issue a second license and send it to that other address. So then you had 2 guys using the same ID, Muhammad Atta, with different addresses. What's going on here? This is how they use duplicate documents to create false histories. And if you want to understand this, you have to read this book by John le Carré. It's called The Little Drummer Girl. It was written in 1982 with the help of Israeli military intelligence. If you've seen the movie, you're probably more confused than anything. But if you read the book, you'll see how they lay a trail. They use this British actress, Diane Keaton played that role in the movie, and she befriends the Palestinian terrorist, and they travel across Europe, and they're leaving behind a trail, so that when a synagogue gets blown up in Germany, he gets blamed, then his car is found blown up on the side of the Autobahn. That's how they leave a false trail. And in the book, the head Mossad guy says to the character Diane Keaton, he says, terror is theater. Theater is a con trick. Do you know what that means, con trick? You've been deceived. And here's another guy, American expert on terrorism from the RAND Corporation. His name is Brian Jenkins from Chicago. He said in 1974, terrorism is aimed at the people watching, not at the actual victims. Terrorism is theater. And then he makes this point. The normal objective of state or official terrorism is to enforce obedience and cooperation. And boy, has that worked well in America. We now have a police state in America where people have to line up to go into the airport, and everything that the state tells you to do, you better do it or you're gonna find yourself in big trouble. So it's all yes sir, no sir, right away sir. Now these are the anomalies, some of the most obvious anomalies of 9/11, very quickly. This is the plane that hit the South Tower. As you can see, the bottom of this plane is not dark blue as a United Airlines plane would be. And furthermore, it has this groove going down the middle of the fuselage, which is indicative of 767 Boeing tanker aircraft. And also, this plane has a very odd thing attached to the bottom of the fuselage here, which is not normal characteristics or normally equipment on a regular passenger aircraft. And as the plane struck the tower, just before it struck the tower, it fired this missile-like object that was burning white hot. Here you see it's from CNN, Spiegel, etc. And it opened up a hole in the building. This is just the millisecond before the plane hit the building. You can see that there's a white-hot hole in the side of the building. And what you can see is that white-hot hole is about exactly the same size as the fuselage that's going to hit it in a minute, which means that the hole is opened up for the plane to go into the building, except for the wings. They have their own problem. Now, this is also creating a white-hot hole. It means it's extremely hot, which indicated to me that this is probably what they call a DU missile, depleted uranium. And they put this warhead, and that warhead burns in the air because it's pyrophoric. It's very, very hot. It's what they use to go into tanks and go into any armor. It's armor-penetrating bullet or missile. And it's the silver bullet in the American military right now. They use it on everything. So it looks like something like that hit. But I said, well, if that was depleted uranium, we must see it coming out the other side of the building. And son of a gun, there we see it. This little object right here, burning white hot, going very fast. There you see it against the blue sky. That's not part of the airplane. It's burning white hot and leaving behind a trail of dark oxides. And I contacted the guy that taught me about depleted uranium in California at Lawrence Livermore Labs. And this old scientist had worked on all those projects from the Manhattan Project all the way through Star Wars. And he taught me everything I knew about depleted uranium. So I asked him, Marion, I said, does this burning object, this little guy right here, does this have the characteristics of a burning DU warhead? And he said, yes, it does. So it looks like that's what happened. Now, why would they do that? Well, that object would open up the hole for the plane, and it would also create a superheated environment inside the tower on that floor, super hot, so that anything that's burnable in that floor would immediately combust into flames. Here we see some explosion, something very peculiar coming out the entry wound where the plane entered the building. We see this energetic explosion coming out. But you can see that then something exploded inside the tower. And what's interesting here is that this explosion is marked by the outside perimeter was white smoke, which may very well be indicative of thermite, because when thermite burns, it produces white smoke, which is aluminum oxide, and incredible heat. The same thing happened to the north tower. The plane went in here, and this big explosion came out the east side of the building. One important point to understand is that both planes went directly into computer floors which contained huge banks of computers, a data center. Not where people worked, just where big boxes of computer stuff were stored, were working. This is the south tower. And what we see here is that the south tower, there was a tremendously energetic thermetic reaction going here, what appears to be on the 81st floor, creating that white smoke I was telling you about. And this is all documented in the reports. They talk about these puffs of white smoke that fell. Well, a thermetic reaction like that creates temperatures of about 2,500 degrees Celsius and molten iron. So this is taken at 9:52 in the morning, 51. 1 minute later, we see this cascade of molten iron pouring off the building. And this fell for 7 minutes until the building fell down. Well, the government can't explain this. Nobody can explain where this molten metal came from. The official report said, oh, it's probably the plane melted, and this is probably aluminum. Nonsense. Molten aluminum in daylight conditions looks like tinfoil. So that's not aluminum. And then, and I have to point out also that these windows are 2 feet across, about that wide across. Yet 1 cubic meter of aluminum weighs 6.5 tons. So that's a lot of stuff. So I finally found out what was on that floor, on the 81st floor, and I found out that it was Fuji Bank's computer center. And a guy that worked there told me that the strange thing was, he said that in the summer before 9/11, they would deliver these big black boxes at night, bigger than this podium here and twice as high, and they were put on the floor inside the computer room, and the people that worked there were told that these were batteries, backup batteries for the computer system. But he said the strange thing was it was never plugged in. They were never plugged in. Well, that indicates to me that that's probably where the thermite was, in those big boxes. That would make sense. Okay. And here we have then the demolition. This is after the cascade. As that went on, the towers just began to explode from the top down. Now you can see this is very energetic. And this is, you're getting material thrust out laterally. This is an explosion. This is not a collapse. That's the collapse. Now, what's interesting about this dust, this is called the dust of the World Trade Center. As I said, the buildings were reduced to dust and steel. This dust had a very strange characteristic, and that is that it contained billions and billions of tiny droplets of molten iron that look like this. This is a population that a scan, you see these look like tennis balls. This is what they look like up close. They're little tiny balls of iron. And billions of these tiny balls were created during the demolition of the World Trade Center. And they were formed at extremely high temperatures, above 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, during the demolition of the towers. Burning jet fuel or office fires cannot possibly produce such molten iron, but thermite can. This is why the government reports have ignored this evidence from the crime scene. And this is another thing that was found in the dust. This is called molybdenum. And droplets of molybdenum were found in the dust. What's peculiar about this is that it has a very, very high melting temperature, about 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. What would have created molten molybdenum in the destruction of the World Trade Center? Well, here we have some culprits, suspected culprits right here. These are thermites. These are basic thermites. This is from the United States Department of Defense. And these top 4 things are thermites. The bottom 4 things are high explosives. And what the bar chart shows you is that these thermites have higher energy density than high explosives. That means they produce more energy per gram than explosives. And it says down here, potential exists to increase kinetics by size reduction. That means if you reduce the size of these particles smaller and smaller and smaller, you get more bang. The very first one is aluminum and molybdenum trioxide. That reaction would produce molten molybdenum. And here we see something indicative of a thermite cutter charge. These box columns like this, they held up the World Trade Center. There were 47 of them. All 47 towers had to fail at the same time, simultaneously, for the building to fall. And this one seems to have been cut with a cutter charge that made the slag drip down on the side. This is the material that was found in the World Trade Center. When they first found it, Niels Harrit was here, and Professor Jones in Utah. They led this team, international team, and they found this material in the dust, and this material was a bilayered material that when they heated it up to 430 degrees Celsius, it went off with a bang and released more energy per gram than any known explosive. So they found out this wasn't paint, this was super thermite. This is what it looked like up close. And my understanding was that the red layer is the thermetic layer, and mixed into the matrix with the thermite is an organic layer which produces the gas pressure, which is the explosion. And this is a very interesting thing. This is called the smoke of the World Trade Center. Smoke compared to dust. This is what rose from the burning pile. Now the pile burned until Christmas of 2001 because they put so much of this thermetic material in the World Trade Center that it just kept cooking off down below the surface. And it made this very thin blue smoke. Now the Environmental Protection Agency, who's supposed to be the watchdog for the environment, told the people of New York the air was safe to breathe. In fact, it was very, very dangerous to breathe this stuff because this smoke contained huge amounts of nanoparticles. Particles that are so small that if you inhale them, they don't get stuck in your throat or your nose or your capillaries. They're so small that they permeate every membrane of the human body until they get to the nucleus of the human cell. There they lodge themselves in the nucleus, and then they start messing with the human system and cause very serious cancers and Parkinson's disease. So that these firefighters who walked on the pile, they were inhaling this stuff. They're like smoking it. And 1,600 of these men have already died of cancer. And there are 5,700 more who are dying of cancer. So you can see there are more people who've been made ill and dying from the smoke than from the crime itself. And as they removed the rubble, they found beneath the rubble molten metal, molten steel in the molten state, dripping. And the firefighters said you'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails like you're in a foundry, like lava, like a volcano. And I called up the American guy who was involved, only one American guy of all four, who was involved in cleaning it up, and he told me that they got down to the bedrock of Manhattan. There were 7 basements, and when they got down to the very basement, the bedrock of Manhattan, they found molten steel in the molten state. And I called up another contractor from Controlled Demolition. I asked him, did you hear about this? And he said, yes, it was. Bottom at the basements of 1, 2, and 7. And I said, how can you explain molten steel, molten iron in the molten state 5 weeks afterwards under a pile of rubble? And he said, think of all the paper that fell down the elevator shafts. And this is another anomaly, a very important one. This is building number 6, World Trade Center 6. Building 7 is here, building 1 is here. They haven't fallen yet. The ground is all very still clean, normal. But this building is burning like a forest fire. Something happened to this building at about 9:03. At about the exact same time as the South Tower was hit, something exploded here. And this is called the U.S. Customs House. And what we see that after one of the buildings has collapsed, you can see that the ground is now very littered, and you see the building has been destroyed. There's a big explosion out this side, and the firemen couldn't put it out. Well, what happened to Building 6? Well, this is Building 6 right here. And in the middle of the building, there's a huge explosion. Something happened from down below in the sub-basement level. That's where 7 was. This is where 1 was. Well, what was in this basement of Building 6? That was where they had all the evidence vault. That's where they had the big vault where they kept all the evidence for the big, big crimes of the 1990s like Enron and WorldCom and George Bush's $200 billion Black Eagle Trust Fund that he used to take on the Soviet Union. All the paper, all those documents, all that evidence was in that basement. And as we now know, the bad guys had gone into that vault the night before, cleaned it out, and then blew it up in the morning. So that the devastation, the bombing of the vault was done to hide the fact that the vault had been robbed the night before. So it's like a Russian doll. It's a crime within a crime within a crime. And the deception is equally complicated. This is, of course, the Pentagon. We're told that a giant 757 or 76 aircraft came across the lawn here and smashed into the building, leaving neither a hole nor any part of itself on the lawn, and leaving these cable spools quite intact. Well, and they never showed us any piece of an airplane being taken out of this building. So where'd the plane go? And we're told that the plane came through like this, and at the front of the plane, this soft aluminum body went all the way through and made this hole in the wall down here. You have to understand that this outside wall of the Pentagon is 1 meter thick reinforced concrete. And we're told that this little aluminum body plane went through it and went all the way through with high energy and made a hole in the wall without taking out the columns in between. Magic. And so that only the FBI was available to look at this part of the this is the exit wound. Only the FBI was allowed here. They locked the area off and said no engineers allowed, because the engineers would have seen obviously that it's a cover-up. So this photo comes courtesy of the FBI. And the guys that went into the Pentagon, were very well protected with respirators and prepared for a toxic environment, and they got decontaminated when they came out. And this is the final slide of the presentation. This is the hole in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where we're told that a large Boeing body went into this hole. Now I have to tell you, this hole is only 20 feet across, between 20 and 24 feet. That's like 8 meters? 8 times 3 is 24? Yeah, 7 or 8 meters across. And the coroner, Wally Miller, he came to this hole, he looked in it, he said, I stopped being a coroner after 20 minutes, there were no bodies. The mayor of Shanksville went there and he said, there's no plane here. So where was the plane? The actual debris field was about a quarter mile in here, further in the woods. Now, I went to the local paper here in Somerset as a journalist. I said, I want to ask you how you covered this story. They said, okay, Mr. Bollyn, come in on Wednesday at 3 o'clock. I came in Wednesday at 3 o'clock. They took me into the back office. They had a brand new $2 million building. I said, wow, this is great. And they sit me down in an office with an American military intelligence officer named Labor Knight. I said, why am I talking to you? He said, I've been seconded to the paper to answer your questions. I said, okay, very good. Can you tell me why there's no evidence of an airplane in this hole? And he said, well, it's very simple. He said, the ground was very soft. And he said, when the plane came very fast, the ground liquefied and swallowed the plane. But he said, but one wing bounced a half mile in the woods. What's up with that? Well, that's because they want to explain why the actual debris field was over here. You see, nobody cares about this hole. They're all out there. And then I contacted the man who owned the cabins in the woods where the debris field was actually located, and he was a Lutheran minister. His name was Hoover. And I said, Reverend Hoover, can you tell me why you have not been upfront and direct with the American people and told us that the actual debris field was on your 9-acre parcel in the woods? And he said, I was just trying to cooperate. That's what everybody says in Shanksville. So it's a big cover up there too. So the question is, people ask, what can we do? What can we do? So we have this information now, what can we do about it? And I said, the war on terror is meant to cause distress, confusion, and fear as it enslaves us to an open-ended criminal war agenda. To accept it without resisting is not rational. To do nothing is not an option. This is what we can do to help ourselves and others. Inform, organize, and act. Inform yourself so you can help undeceive others. And if you don't know what I've written 2 books, a set of books called Solving 9/11. This is the main book, Deception Changed the World. I have 10 of them with me. And you can read that and you can understand what really happened on 9/11. My book is unique in 9/11 literature because I go to the question, who did it and why they did it. It's pointless to be arguing about what happened 15 years ago when we're engaged in a $1 trillion war because of what happened 15 years ago. And then you organize, like Frank has done here, organize this wonderful event, brought people together, organize this as a group, and act. Do like Frank did. Spread the word, engage, take political action, join the boycott movement. If Israel is a rogue state, out of line, boycott it. Don't buy Israeli fruit. Don't buy Israeli products. Buy Spanish oranges. Buy somebody else's stuff. And so take meaningful action. And why? Why do we do this? Because as Kennedy said, what kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, which is what we have now. It's no peace. And not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I'm talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. John F. Kennedy. So with that, I want to say thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I think we have time for some questions.
Yeah, I think Thank you very much. It
Thank
was
you.
absolutely
Thank you very much.
amazing.
Thank you.
And now it's time for question, if you have any.
And please keep your questions on subject to the war on terror or 9/11, and bring your question, make it brief.
Actually, I have a personal question, which is also concerns 9/11 in general. You being a homie, you're probably well acquainted with Noam Chomsky, and him being a gatekeeper.
Who?
Noam Chomsky.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So it's just on a personal note. I'll just do it very brief. Do you think he's been threatened, or he's been a COINTEL stooge from the start? Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's the latter. Anybody who's been in America and knows Noam Chomsky knows that he's taken on this position where he's, of course, been critical of the United States involvement in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. And he went to Israel back in the 1950s before he started all that with his Jewish wife. And they went to a kibbutz for about 5 weeks or 6 weeks, and the rest of the year he spent in London. So I approached Mr. Chomsky and asked him a letter, in a written letter. I said, do you have any experience with the Tavistock Institute? Tavistock is British psychological warfare. And he wrote back and pretended he didn't know what Tavistock was. I find that very odd. I tend to think that he's been an agent of that sort all along, because his position on 9/11 is so completely contradictory to his other work. It makes no sense. It makes no sense for him to be understanding American crimes and Israeli crimes and Zionist crimes, and then suddenly to draw a complete blank. So I think it's been something like that. You see, what they do with these alternative voices and controlled media, like Alex Jones. There's a guy in America called Alex Jones. Alex Jones is the same. They create these, just like the media, just like the controlled media. They create a large body of followers who believe everything that Alex Jones says, and then that's very easy. He can play the role of the Pied Piper and take his group into the woods when it's necessary to do so. So Alex Jones is another one. He won't go near discussing Israeli involvement in 9/11. I just spoke in Austin, Texas the other day, and he was invited 4 times to come to the event. It was the only event in Austin that day on 9/11. He didn't show up. Another question?
It's because I've seen a video footage of, I think it was live TV back from 2001 with the flight entering the building, but then somebody caught that one of the wings that was flying into the building was like a building behind the wing, and then the wing actually, flew right into it, like it wasn't there, like it was just edited into the footage.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
So it was never there.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. That's very interesting footage. She's referring to footage that looks like part of the plane did not go in the right place where it should have been in the video. Now that may be fraudulent video, I don't know. I know some people say that this is evidence that planes did not strike the buildings. Some people say that. But whatever struck the buildings, was apparently drone planes, and it looks like those planes went through the buildings with great vigor. There were some plane parts found, were not identified, and some projectiles went flying with very great speed out the other side of the building too. So my only position on that is that the fact that there's a problematic video or a video that may be fraudulent does not mean that planes did not strike the World Trade Center. You hear what I'm saying? A fraudulent video is not evidence of something not, But I've seen that video, and it's very bizarre.
Yeah, because to me it looked like that it was actually, just put in there, that it was actually not there.
Yeah.
And it was made up footage.
Yeah,
So
I understand. This is the argument that it was that what we saw in those videos was computer-generated imagery.
Yes.
Versus actual planes.
Yeah.
But as I said, it certainly looks like large planes hit the building. Eyewitnesses heard large planes hit the building. We could hear the sound of them, and as I said, something like big planes did hit the buildings. So That's as far as I can go with that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Now there's this quote that says, "Follow the money."
Mhm.
Now you mentioned oil, but of course you also looked into the industry for the arms and weapons and so on. I think it's called the Carlyle Group, or what? You didn't mention so much about Bush and all the rest of the administration's money in this firm or in these firms.
Yeah. Well, as you say, the Bushes and the Cheneys and all these people that have money in America are invested in war stocks. I mean, it's big business in America. 55 cents of every tax dollar goes into this business, so that's where to put your money. As you said, there's Halliburton, there's Dick Cheney, there's other companies like General Dynamics and Halliburton and Northrop Grumman. There's so many of them. A lot of money was made by those groups. Some of them in particular are very suspect, like the General Dynamics company. They have a huge amount of business. But whenever the nation goes to war, the war business is good. I mean, this is America's business these days, unfortunately, very unfortunately. And these people got richer from that. That's true. But that doesn't mean that, a lot of people want to put this 9/11 into the lap of George Bush or Dick Cheney. Well, I can understand that. They certainly failed that day. They certainly committed treason. They certainly should be George Bush should not be painting watercolors in Texas. He belongs in jail. He belongs convicted of war crimes because, first of all, they prevented any meaningful investigation. As I said, there was no investigation of 9/11. That in itself should be a crime. But they said it was an act of war, so they're legally protected. But then for 2 years, they prevented any sort of meaningful investigation. But more importantly, George Bush and Tony Blair conspired in a criminal war of aggression, which is the supreme war crime. For that, we hanged Nazis in Nuremberg. George Bush and Tony Blair deserve the same if they're found guilty of committing a war crime. And they did. So and what we need in America, we need a proper investigation in which Cheney, Bush, Chertoff, Ashcroft, Ali Hoopa are put into court and investigated to the full extent of the law to find out what they knew. Because that's the only way you'll get the whole network. You see, America today has become a crimocracy, a government of criminals, for criminals, by criminals. So it's like the removal of one person isn't going to change anything. And bringing a new criminal to run the operation isn't going to change anything either. Americans all have hopes. Oh, they always ask me, well, what do you think of Trump? Is Trump... what can I say? I don't want to pop their balloon. But it's like, come on, this is totally fake. The whole thing is fake. Trump is just as closely in bed with the Israelis as is Clinton. And they're both tied completely to this operation. So I said if Trump were really a 9/11 truth guy, he would have done something. He would have said something. He would have donated to Bollyn.com. He's done nothing.
But what is the Saudi connection?
What is the Saudi connection? Well, that's very interesting. The 28 pages is no longer secret. The 28 pages came out, and the 28 pages said exactly what we thought it said, that some guy from the Saudi royal family lent or donated or supported two Saudi guys that were new arrivals in San Diego and helped pay their first month rent. In America, you come to America, you have to pay first month, second month, last month. So you wind up having to pay a whole lot of money down. And he helped do that for these two Saudi guys who were then allegedly on Flight 77 to hit the Pentagon. We'll go back. We have no evidence of Flight 77 hitting the Pentagon. There's no evidence of an aircraft hitting the Pentagon. So whether some Saudi gave some money to another Saudi guy, before 9/11 is meaningless unless you actually can find that they're involved in the crime itself. The Saudis, if anything, have just been played for financiers of this stuff because, the United States protects Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is protected by the United States. And so Saudi Arabia does what the United States and Israel tells it to do, basically. And they're crazy now, fighting in Yemen, fighting against Iran. They're way, way over their depth.
But do you think there would be any court cases in the U.S.?
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. Even though I don't see any evidence of Saudi involvement at the level of 9/11, an American court would be very quick to lay a $10 billion lawsuit against Saudi Arabia because they can smell the money. They've done the same thing to Iran already. Money, Libya, anybody. They go after money wherever they can find it. That's what lawyers do for a living.
I go one step further from the no-plane theory. I listen a lot to a podcast called Fakeologist Radio, who deals with footage from Simon Shack's work September Clues, and they are on the media fakery issue that all the images from that day are a prefabricated movie, and they are put out on the big media channels. They actually send the same material on the 5 biggest media channels. So it's their theory, it's pre-manufactured material, and the witnesses are actors, and actually no people died at that day. They simply closed down the area during the night, and then blown the buildings off camera. They haven't filmed the event at all, so we haven't not seen any real footage at all from 9/11. What do you think about that kind of theory?
Well, I mean, I've heard all kinds of theories about no planes and no towers, no New York City. I mean, New York City existed, the towers no longer exist. It looks like 2 planes went in the building. We know that about 3,000 people were killed, and we know they went to the war on terror. So we need to get to the bottom of it. And I really don't, some people will say, oh, no thermite was used, and nuclear bombs were used, and Judy Wood says that it was a cold event. These are all what we call red herrings. I work with evidence of what we actually have in front of us. And as you say, it may be some CGI, I don't know, but how did they do that they had some sort of missile that went in the building that left these holes in the building and carried through the building and created this huge explosion? That's kind of hard to figure out. But I don't think that really takes us anywhere. It's like it's like rearranging the decks on the Titanic, the chairs on the Titanic as it's going down. We got a sinking ship, we got to deal with the sinking ship, not the chairs. You see what I'm saying? So I mean, the arguments about these, what I consider details, are kind of pointless, because we now are 15 years later, those 3,000 people were killed. The history of the United States and the history of Europe has changed. We're now in an open-ended war with the Middle East, which, according to our politicians that are going to be taking over power in the United States, we are going to be looking at more war with Iran, with Russia. I mean, this hostility in America against Russia is extremely dangerous. You get Fox News on there, and they're talking about going to war with Russia. Huh? Where's the peace dividend? What happened here? Why is now suddenly Russia the enemy? And you have to understand that this is all part of the Zionist war agenda. As I pointed out, the lady that brought us the crisis in Ukraine, which has brought the United States and the West close to war with Russia, is Mrs. Kagan. Her husband brought us the war in Iraq and the surge in Iraq. Now they're bringing us a war with Iran. I think these people need to be arrested.
Yeah.
I just have a very simple question, as I like to be solution-oriented. And I think there was a very little talk about some kind of solution. So I was thinking about banks. Can we do anything about moving our money? Because I realized that I cannot put my money in anywhere for my pension, because all of it is helping either the medicine factories or the weapon thing. Whatever I looked to put my pension money in, it was not possible to make it grow.
Right.
There were places, but I wouldn't get any money.
Right.
Now, isn't there a place where we could do a solution is to change the banks?
Yeah, what we have to do is, we have to do that, absolutely. We have to renege these private banks that have taken over control of our country. If I understand correctly, the National Bank of Denmark is in the same situation as the Federal Reserve. It's owned by a bunch of private banksters who use fractional banking and stuff to indebt us and enslave our nations. So clearly we have to turn that around. And every president that's tried to do so in the United States has been killed. But that's what has to be done. We have to free our nations of this debt slavery and install real national banks that issue credit to the people on behalf of the state. That's what we need. But how do we get there? To get there, it's going to require a large popular movement. It's going to require action. At this point, we are still a vanguard. We're a small group because not enough people understand it, and we haven't gotten to that position where we can overthrow the apple cart. But that has to happen. The United States is now, trillions of dollars in debt. All the money that we give for taxes doesn't even pay the interest on the debt. How much further can you go like that? It can't go on very much further. The American infrastructure is crumbling. The nation's being taken from war to war. We're threatening nuclear war with Russia. They're bringing us to the catastrophe, to a brink of catastrophe, These are the people that are doing it, these banksters. We have to overthrow the banksters.
But is it every bank? Is every bank is there any banks that one could think is not in conspiracy with everyone?
Well, it's the system. The system is rigged against us. But I have a little bank in Washington. It's a family-owned bank, which works for me. But it's all part of the same system, you see? And what we have to do is at the top, we have to reorganize how our states are financed. And what we have allowed over a period of time, in the United States, they've corrupted our Constitution. Only Congress has the right to declare war. Only Congress has the right to print money. Well, we've gotten rid of both of those. The president goes to war anytime he feels like it. The president goes to war wherever he feels like it, and Congress does nothing. And Congress doesn't print any money. It's all being done by the Federal Reserve. And until those situations get rectified, don't expect any solutions. But we have crimes to solve too. Hard to say. Might.
Iceland did it.
Yeah, Iceland did it.
Okay, I have a question that's quite interesting because it's about the connection between the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, and the war on terror. What is the connection between these two big events in our time, so to speak?
Well, the Arab Spring, he's asking about the Arab Spring. I think the Arab Spring was in many ways genuine in Tunisia. There was legitimate grievances there. And there were, of course, legitimate grievances across the Arab world. And then, of course, they saw in certain places they had to reverse the Arab Spring, like in Egypt, and reinstate the military. That's what the United States did. They said, forget your Arab Spring in Egypt. Forget Islamic or Muslim Brotherhood leading the country. We're going to overthrow that and put the Israelis and the Americans back in charge with the Egyptian army. Then what they saw in Syria, they say, here's an opportunity to take Syria down. So we will support the radicals who we train in Jordan, who we arm in Jordan, who we give funds to, and provide material flow from Turkey. And we create all these bad barking dogs who are crucifying kids. That's American tax dollars at work. It's sick. It's totally sick. But what I find most problematic about this is that in America, nobody's talking about it. As I said, the Syrian war is a non-issue in America. How can it be a non-issue? Where the United States is responsible for the plight of the Syrian people. My wife is a teacher in Sweden and is Christian school. She has now 13 refugee kids who she teaches from Syria, from Iraq, and from Afghanistan. And she was telling, but before we went on the tour in America, she was telling at the prayer session, pray for my husband and myself, we're going to teach America, talk about truth in America and ending the war. And the history teacher said, what war? What war? And it's the same thing in America. What war? We're not at a war. Question.
You grazed the matter a bit earlier. You said that no one believed the story anymore. They just stopped having the polls.
Yeah.
But they still believe in the presidential circus.
Yeah.
How, in your opinion, are the Americans, how close are they to waking up? Do they still buy all this?
Well, there's a very significant population in America that knows the situation. There's a lot of people. And there's a lot of people who are just at that brink. They're mad as hell. They know the system's rigged. They know that everything is rigged against them. There will be always about 90% of the population doesn't do anything, just does watching TV. The problem is in America is that the media is so controlled that the Americans have no understanding what's really going on. That's the problem. I don't know how it is here in Denmark, but in Sweden it's not very good either. The media is very tightly controlled. News is very brief. They don't tell you anything. And you can't have a democratic nation with an ignorant public. I'm sorry, it just doesn't go. When you have an ignorant public, when the media is controlled by 6 corporations, you have an oligarchy at best, or a kleptocracy, or a crimocracy, as I call it. The criminals run the operation, because the criminals in America run the voting machines. So we go think, vote, 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 yeah, rock the vote. You put your vote in there, and at the end of the day, it's counted by a computer machine that's owned by a private company who controls all the data. The American people don't watch any single vote being counted in their own eyes. That's not a democratic election. And they say, oh, we'll go monitor elections in Serbia. We'll go monitor elections in Iran. We'll send Jimmy Carter there to watch how they do it. We need election monitors in the United States of America. That's where we need it. And it's so far gone. And I love my country, even though I've lived 7 years in exile. I love my country, but it's really sad to see it today. You know, and it's a circus. It's a circus, this whole Trump-Clinton thing. And people, Americans, every 4 years, wake up out of their slumber and say, yeah, go Trump, go Clinton. But it's like children. They're like children. They pin their hopes on one candidate, think that guy's going to take us out of the jungle. No, we have to get out of the jungle ourselves. And we can't do it unless we're informed. And that's the job we have to do. We have the information, we have to inform others, and others, and others, because it's going to be a revolution of awareness. And when enough of us understand what we've been duped by and lied, whether it's chemtrails or Fukushima or 9/11, when we understand that the whole thing is a big hoax and a big lie, and they enslave us with deception, then we have a fighting chance. Thank you. It's 9:30, so I think that I want to say thank you very much. I really appreciate being here, and I look forward to seeing the rest of the event tomorrow. Thank you very much. Oh, I do have some books outside. In the hallway there, in the next room. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bollyn. It was absolutely great. I think a lot of stones are now fallen. I would ask you to take up all your garbage so we have a clean, nice room tomorrow. Okay? Have a good trip home. Thank you.